Hey everyone, it's the host of All Across America, Marco Vig, jumping in for a few seconds before the show to thank y'all for listening, to let you know that I want to hear from you. Tell me what you like about the show, and send me your suggestions too. Follow us on Instagram at AllXAmerica, or visit the website, allacrossamerica.net, and you can use our contact page there. If you want to support us, we're on Patreon at patreon.com/allacrossamerica. Try to respond personally to everyone who reaches out, so say hello. All right, on with the show. Podcasting from Portland East to Portland West, from Big Pine Key to Pacific Beach, and from San Juan to Guam, this is All Across America. You've written a book that I wanted to talk about, people I met hitchhiking on USA highways. You've got a book of poetry that's coming out, the so-called poems. You had a album that came out some years ago, and you had said that people always want to talk about being a singer-songwriter, what you were doing hitchhiking, being a poet, but not why, not what you were singing about, not why you were hitchhiking. So maybe you could walk us through, you took two separate long journeys. Maybe you could kind of walk us through why you set out on these adventures.
Sure. The first time, I had been in college, and the Vietnam War became more and more an obviously insane and evil adventure that was capturing America more and more. And I couldn't see my way forward. I wanted to avoid getting drafted. And just then, I was awarded a fellowship to go to graduate school to study literature. Well, I didn't really want to study literature. I knew about as much about literature as the people who were teaching me, I thought. I still think. But I took the fellowship to avoid getting drafted, and I became a teacher. And I taught for a few years, and the war was grinding on, and I just couldn't bear the life I was leading, and I thought, well, better to try a desperate adventure. So I took my savings till then, which were kind of laughable, and I started hitchhiking around the United States. I took odd jobs. I lived on $2 a day. I ate mainly sunflower seeds or soybeans and an orange most days. And I did that for about 3.5 years. Sometimes I took a job for a month or two if somebody allowed me to live in their garage or something like that.
Wow.
And I realized I was going to die if I didn't find a way to settle down and earn my way, because I was running out of everything.
Yeah.
So I did, and I settled down for a while. The second time I started hitchhiking, I couldn't find a way to get my ideas into circulation. So the woman who became my wife taught me how to silkscreen posters. So I silkscreened posters with a picture of a very dissatisfied face and different mottos like, "You're like me in this respect, what you do has its effect." And I hitchhiked back and forth across the United States, sleeping outside and stapling these posters to utility poles for a year and a half.
Okay.
I did about 1,500 posters that way. And
Wow.
people around the world heard about them, and they put them on different continents also. But mostly they went on USA highways. So that's the story of my hitchhike.
Wow. And this poster, you said it's a picture of a very dissatisfied man, which I would agree. He's got kind of a sullen look. And to me, I was saying to myself, in one of these posters is on the back of your book, and it says, and again, just to repeat this one slogan on this particular poster, "You're like me in this respect, what you do has its effect." Can you talk about the juxtaposition between this kind of sullen-looking face and the slogan itself? Is that supposed to highlight the slogan? Tell me about that.
There were people exist in a kind of a spectrum. Most of the people who were motivated were motivated either to score lots of money or to score lots of status, like becoming a general in the Vietnam War, something like that. And most of the people who had better motivations, who wanted a better world, who weren't satisfied to be ruled the way we were being ruled and to live the way we were being programmed to live, most of them were being driven to have very weak motivation and to try to just survive as best they could and kind of whine and complain and feel helpless. And I was trying to strengthen their hands at the expense of other people. I'm still doing that. That's what I do all the time. My wife likes to say that I do the same thing over and over again, but I like to say I'm doing one thing and I haven't finished it yet. She's right. She's right, of course. I need more variety or I'll die.
So tell me, what do you mean by variety?
Well, I'm very dedicated to changing the world. And since I get almost no response that I know of from my efforts to change the world, I tend to dig in and just work harder and harder and harder at that same thing. And if I don't try to please myself a little more than I've done, then I'll die. That's the typical thing that happens to the people who've been my heroes in the world. They either die of exhaustion or they get executed, one way or the other.
Right. And so, yeah, I mean, you have these posters. This was, sometime before the internet, and there is no way that you can be reached. It just says, E. Am I pronouncing your Chaet? Am I pronouncing your last name properly, Eric? Chaet. Okay, so it says E. Chaet on it, and that's really it. And back in the day, when many of these posters were going up, there was no such thing as Google. The best they could do was kind of look you up in the phone book. But I didn't have a phone either. Right. So, I mean, not only there wasn't really a way that you could have gotten feedback, and maybe you did really change people's lives by putting that poster out there, but didn't know about it.
Yeah, I think you're right, Mark. But I was also sending out things to try to get them published, and I got a pretty steady diet of rejection because there wasn't a ready market for what I was doing. Okay.
And what were you doing at the time? What was this?
Well, the book that became People I Met Hitchhiking on USA Highways is the chapters are individual stories, and I kept trying to get them published. And until the internet happened, I didn't get them published. People didn't want to publish them.
Right.
It wasn't what they were already publishing, which of course was the very point.
Right. Well, you do have a collection of poems that's coming out. They're called the So-Called Poems, and that's with a publishing house out of Colorado, I believe you were saying. How were you able to get that published?
Whoa. Well, 1977, that's, back in the Middle Ages, I was interviewed on the radio in Marquette, Michigan. Somebody got interested enough in me to interview me. And one person heard that and was inspired by it. So about 5 years ago now, this person started to find my poems online. And he read them, and he got interested in them, and then he eventually started a publishing house, and he invited me to publish a book of my poems.
That's great.
He told me, yeah, that is great. If it can just accelerate a little bit, I'll be okay.
Right.
So that's how that happened. That fellow's name, by the way, is Lawrence Abbey Gautier. He's the publisher, and he's also a very fine writer himself.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, unfortunately, in the book world, it sometimes takes 18 months to go from manuscript to market, it feels like, and it sounds like it's no different in this case.
And for me, it's got to get to the readers who are receptive to it and then they have to be able to take advantage of it to modify their behavior to their advantage, and then I've got to find out about it before it's really complete. Just getting it into print, that's a huge hurdle, but to me
Right.
that's not anything like the end product.
Right.
I wrote a book before people I met hitchhiking on USA highways called How to Change the World Forever for Better.
Okay.
And that's the business I'm in.
Okay. Well, tell me about that book. Tell me about that business. Tell me some more.
Okay. Well, like I say, I was dissatisfied with the way we're ruled, and I was also dissatisfied with the way we adapt to how we're ruled. If you look at the world today, for instance, you can see that there are terrible autocracies like Putin's Russia.
Right. Sure.
But there are also, on the other side, there's a much gentler form of, it's not totalitarianism, but it's co-opted almost everyone's time and attention. And that's the world of commerce, in which the people
Right.
who start with the most have a huge advantage. It's not an equal playing field. And so the people who control the great fortunes, whether they inherited or earned it or were lucky or were thieves or were, whatever, however, the people with the great fortunes are our oligarchs. We don't have a Putin, but we sure as hell have oligarchs. And we either adapt to them entirely, in which case we're ruled just as much as if we lived in a totalitarian state, or we adapt to them just enough so that we're not starved to death or executed for saying the wrong thing at the wrong time, and we do something else. But the something else, it's been 6,000 years of history now. Is humanity going to always be ruled either by Russian-type autocracy or by this gentler form of near totalitarianism, which is commercial, or are we going to evolve into a species that's more than ants and woodchucks?
Right.
Are we going to use our freedom? Are we going to become who we would like people to be?
Okay. Is the book, is your approach to it more, I guess, a rhetorical, philosophical frame, or is it more from the mechanics of here's the steps in order to change the world, or is it more to get people to think for themselves?
It's kind of shock therapy, and I use myself as an example. I'm not wise enough or capable enough to be the great leader, but by showing my struggle to do what I think needs to be done, I hope to inspire other people to struggle similarly. And I hope to reach a critical mass of such people who are struggling, first of all, to make themselves capable of doing more than anybody expects them to do, without pretending to themselves that they've already achieved something great while the world is still the same mess it's already been. And I'm trying to recruit a nonviolent revolution of sorts.
Okay. And what would that look like?
Oh, I wish I knew. I wish I knew. It would be, I guess, many thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, each doing something extraordinary that nobody expects of them, including me, that nobody's imagined yet, that they imagine it in their secret hearts, but nobody around them gives them any support. There's no infrastructure for them. The infrastructure is all to fit in and maintain what is now. And as a result, the infrastructure is more a barrier. It's like you were talking about technology before. It's a blessing and a curse.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, sure is. Would you say in all of the people that you met hitchhiking that you certainly changed their lives in a way, and that or brought them some measure of comfort, and that it sounds like a lot of the folks that you
took rides with were looking for somebody to talk to.
You're
Lots
right
of
about that.
divorce stories being dumped, and they were looking for a sounding board. How do you feel about that? Can you tell me more?
Sure. I affected some of them a lot, and some of them a little, and some of them affected me a lot, and some of them a little, and some of them were extraordinary people, and some of them were just normal people who hadn't considered the danger of picking up a stranger. Most of them were pretty brave. Most of them were pretty brave, though, because they thought that they could handle a stranger, and so they were a little braver than normal and a little more adventurous than normal with their thoughts, a little more receptive.
Okay.
But there was a huge spectrum. Some of them just picked me up out of pity, I'm sure.
Yeah. Would you say that these people are brave in general, or the circumstances at that point in their lives made them seem more brave, or they felt they had nothing to lose? You get divorced. Go ahead.
I think you're describing everybody who's brave. Nobody's brave if they don't have to be. If you just can't bear things the way they are, you have to get brave or you have to collapse and die, one or the other.
Right. Maybe you could tell a story about, you had mentioned some of them have changed you. Can you talk about a ride in particular that you felt changed your outlook on things?
Oh, sure. At one point, I was in Arkansas in December, and I had $6 in my pocket, and that's all I had in the world. And it was late December, and it was cold, and it was night. And a fellow picked me up who took me to his home in southern Wisconsin and gave me a place to stay and gave me some work clothes and put me to work on a crew of his that installed giant iron racks for storage in factories. And I was...
that was Manuel?
Yeah, Manuel Fabricanti, I call him. Of course, that's not his real name. I won't use his real name. Anyway, he was very kind, and he paid me $12 an hour when I would have gladly worked for $6. And I was a technological fool then, and he gave me a job doing mechanical work. And I talk about learning on the job. I made every mistake possible before I got it right. But I think I did a good job for him for about 6 months, I think. But like with a lot of people I've met in this world, when I wouldn't stay with him for the rest of my life, when I returned to what I was doing before, he dropped me like a hot potato. And he was really motivated to succeed in the world the way it was. He'd come from a very poor situation. And I think probably he succeeded. He was succeeding at what he was doing when I worked for him, though he had trouble finding people to work for him because he was as driven in his way as I am in mine. But I certainly learned from him all kinds of mechanical skills and project management. And also I went from having $6 to having a good deal of money for a while, which helped.
Wow. So you got a ride with Manuel all the way from Arkansas to Wisconsin.
Yeah, in the middle of the night.
Wow.
Plus, he needed conversation to stay awake, so I was doing something for him.
Right. That was truly a symbiotic relationship there. And I think you had said one of the cardinal sins of hitchhiking is to fall asleep on the ride.
Oh, I did that once. I felt so ashamed of myself, but I couldn't help it.
Well, you got to sleep. I mean, also, I think it's a measure of self-preservation, too. You don't always know who you're with.
Yeah, but the other guy could fall asleep and then you're dead.
Right. Yeah, that's always an issue. Did you ever feel, and nowhere in the book did you ever mention anything about feeling unsafe? Were there times that you did, or rides that you declined, or rides that you fibbed and... Go ahead.
Yeah. There was a guy picked me up in Pennsylvania and pointed a gun at me.
Wow.
And he said, I work hard and you're just drifting around. And I explained to him that I had very little money, but the money I had, I'd earned working in a factory, which was true at the time. And he put the gun away. And another time, I got a ride with two guys across Indiana who were drinking whiskey like crazy. And the only reason we didn't die is there was nothing to hit. It was perfectly flat road, but we went about 100 miles an hour with drunks for a couple of times.
Times that I've hitchhiked, and certainly not to the extent that you've done it. I mean, one of the most freeing, liberating things in the world is sitting in the back of a pickup truck, with your back to the cab and just kind of letting the wind flow through you and kind of holding on to the side. Did you get a lot of rides like that?
Yes, and ain't it lovely? If only it could go on
It really,
forever.
I know, it really is. No, you're not forced to talk to anybody. They're not worried about you. You're just kind of a couple extra bags of sand in the back. And I've gotten some rides.
It's ecstasy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would pay somebody to give me a ride in the back of their pickup truck. Bring along some lunch and sit there and enjoy it and have them turn right around and drive me back.
I can see that. Yeah.
There should be a service for it.
Now that you mentioned it, it will probably occur.
But really, I mean, I just remember one trip in particular. I was hiking on the Appalachian Trail in western North Carolina, and just getting a ride. I think it was outside of Bryson City, and a woman in her pickup truck back up to the mountain from town, and it was just a beautiful June day around 5 o'clock, and just an evening time, and it was just such an amazing ride. I think it was me and my brother at the time, and it was probably a half hour, and it was great. And just watching the mountains, it's like seeing a movie unfold as it's like reality. it's watching a movie unfold while the wind is whipping through by your face at 60 miles an hour. I think that's one of the great pleasures. Have you hitchhiked recently?
No, I'm not young anymore, and I don't know that I could not use a bathroom often enough, that I could stay awake often enough. If I get desperate enough, yes, I may do it yet. I don't guarantee I won't, but I think it's not likely. But who knows? Who knows? Look what's happening in Ukraine. Who knew what they were going to go through? Who knows?
Sure. So the first time the first large extent of your hitchhiking was 3.5 years. Could you kind of just give us the broad overview of what your travels were in those 3.5 years?
Well, I had an uncle in Los Angeles, and I started from Lawrence, Kansas, where I had finished up graduate school. So I went and visited him briefly, and then I hitchhiked back the other direction, I guess, toward the East Coast. I went back and forth between the West and East Coast a few times. In Albany, New York, a former fellow student of mine was a professor then, and he and his wife were driving to New York City for some errand, and I still had a student ID card, and for $100, I bought a Icelandic Airlines ticket that took me to Luxembourg. In Luxembourg, I met a guy, in the New York City airport, I met a fellow who'd been robbed in Peru. He was about 17 years old. And I was able to help him get a ticket back to France, to Luxembourg in France, because he didn't know enough English and I knew just enough French to be able to work between the two of them. So I went to Paris. And then I went to Amsterdam and Paris and London, all very briefly, and then I came back. And by this time, I had no home. And so I just kept hitchhiking and having adventures and taking odd jobs. And like I said, that lasted 3.5 years. But toward the end, I caught myself just going back and forth. I wasn't getting anywhere at all. I was just exhausting myself, and my resources were dwindling to nothing. And I thought, I'm not changing the world this way, and not only that, I'm not preserving myself. I'm not going to make it this way. So then I started looking for a place to put down some roots for at least a while, and that while has lasted 35 years or so.
Wow. And you're in Wisconsin now. What you said you grew up on the south side of Chicago?
I did.
Okay. And what brought you to Wisconsin?
Well, I was in Kansas, I guess, staying briefly at a home of a former student and his wife. The wife was not glad that I was there at all. And a woman that I had known in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, this is the woman who's now my wife, was living in Wisconsin, and she somehow or another got the phone number and called and invited me to visit her. And the joke we always say is I came to visit and I never left. And that's true. That is what happened.
Wow. Okay. And your wife is originally from Wisconsin.
And she's originally from the UP of Michigan, which is about 100 miles up the road.
Right. Okay. Yes, I've driven through the UP. I was supposed to take a ferry across, I guess it was Lake Michigan, out of I'm forgetting the town now, but we were going up to Wisconsin. The wind was just an incredible storm had pulled through, and I guess the waves were 10 feet. So the ferry was canceled, and we had to take the long route from Chicago. We went all the way through the Upper Peninsula, through Wisconsin, Upper Peninsula, and then down into Traverse City, Michigan. That was our destination. So but
nice
beautiful place. Yeah, it's really nice.
When it's not winter.
Yes.
It's glorious.
Yeah.
When it's winter, look out.
Yeah, I learned from somebody that had spent some time up there that right around Labor Day, a big storm pulls through, and that kind of ushers in the end of summer. And that was it for us. We were there right during that big storm, and then it got cold. But we had a nice couple of days on the Standing Bear National Dunes, I think it's called, or Sleeping Bear. I think it's called Sleeping Bear National Dunes, which is the beautiful dunes on the shore of Lake Michigan on the eastern side. So, really beautiful country in the Midwest there. And you spent a lot of time in the Midwest. You went to undergraduate at University of Missouri, is that correct?
That's right.
And University of Kansas, and now, of course, in Wisconsin. And, of course, you've spent a lot of time, as you mentioned, out in Los Angeles and back on the East Coast. How do you find the Midwest different than the rest of the country?
Well, the Midwest tends to be backward technologically and deprived economically. But that's all just a matter of degree. The Midwest is part of the United States of America. And the United States of America is technologically advanced and economically advantaged. So it's all relative. I would rather live in my penthouse in Manhattan or on my private island in the Caribbean, but that was not an option. So I took what I could get and tried to make the best of it.
Well, it sounds like you certainly have.
Sometimes it feels like it.
Yeah, and then in we talked a little bit about the 3.5 years that you had spent, and you stayed with some people and worked jobs here and there. And then in the second part of hitchhiking was 1.5 years, and that's when you were really putting these posters up. Can you talk more about that? Was there a rhyme or reason and where you were going, or you were just putting up these posters wherever you landed?
I was trying to foment a nonviolent revolution of individuals in America who were not content with just either getting by or getting ahead in America the way it was and still is. I was doing the most I knew how to do with what I had, and if I had the strength and youth that I had then, which was already beginning to fade a little, I would do it again on a larger scale. And
Wow.
when this book of poetry comes out, I will have to do something that is similar somehow. I have to find a way to reach the individuals that everybody imagines don't exist, and strengthen their hands and give them an idea of how things can be done that no one else imagines can be done, that are to the good. It's easy to change things for the worse. Mr. Putin is an excellent example. He's changing the world, but he's changing it in a very bad way. I'm looking for some way for individuals to change the world radically in a way that is good and irrevocable. Again, it's easy to change things briefly, but then everybody falls back into what they were doing before because it's so much easier. It's so hard to cause the world to be different than the world is now. You look at the ants and the woodchucks, they've been doing what they've been doing forever. And we only have 6,000 years of history, but to me it looks like for 6,000 years people have been doing approximately the same thing, either getting by or getting ahead, and then everything falls apart with war. And in the meantime, somebody persecutes somebody else. And we have to break out of that, or we won't break out of that.
Okay. And what would it be? What would this world in your what would it look like? Would it be a utopia?
How we get to what I hope for, I don't know, and what it will look like, I don't know, and that's maybe the main reason why it's so hard to try to make it happen. Because when you stop and ask, what would it look like? What would it look like? Well, I don't know. I don't know. It's never existed. But what does exist hurts almost everybody. And a very small minority of people have a great deal of fun, but almost everybody else is paying for it. And that fun that those few people have, and I suspect, though I've never been there, is only lasts about as long as a meal.
Right. It is definitely very fleeting.
I think so. But even if it's not so, even if 10 million people in the world now do very well in the way the world is right now, that leaves everybody else. I don't find that satisfactory, especially since I'm one of the everybody else.
Yeah. What is your wife's take on all this?
My wife helps people. She has a wonderful heart, and she helps people. And my idea is that helping people is much better than not helping people. But helping people now, the way things are, is helping people to either fit in or get ahead, rather than fail and collapse and be in despair and die. And that's a big thing. But what I'm trying to do is change the whole thing. And the odds are I will fail and that she will have done more good than I. That's my motivation, to make sure I don't fail.
Right.
My wife my wife just said she wants me to say that she's an occupational therapist.
Okay. All right. Well, that's very important to everybody working in healthcare and our teachers out there. And, these are folks that are really, changing lives and making lives better one person at a time.
Sure.
That's terrific. And your approach has been more philosophical, I would say, or on a more larger, grander scale.
I call it politics. Cosmic politics.
Okay. Cosmic politics. I like that. Politics. Would you say, the hitchhiking, the traveling around for as long as you did was a way of escapism from such a large, intractable problem that, no one person, one man, no matter how many posters they put up, can affect such grand change, and maybe the hitchhiking was an escape in some way?
Absolutely. The first 3.5 years, it was mainly an escape, and I had no posters then. I just couldn't bear going on the way it was. And it was an escape to save my life. I was being ground into dust.
Right. And in some respects, I've gotten rides before, and sometimes it is part of the journey, not necessarily the destination. And clearly, when you're hitchhiking back and forth across the country, it's less of a geographic destination, more so, a psychological, a mental destination. Is there a feeling of being let down when you get a ride and they're going exactly where you wanted to go, or they're going, you're trying to get to Kansas and they're going straight to LA? Does that room the challenge? Is it more fun to get more rides and meet more people and get distracted in different ways?
Well, I didn't know where the hell I was going, but I tried to stay outside of the cities, because if nighttime fell and I was outside the city, I could put down my sleeping bag and go to sleep for free. And I didn't have to fear either the police or the people the police protect us from. Just animals I had to fear.
Right.
So, I forget the rest of your question. I'm sorry.
Well, just in terms of if you're meeting somebody that's going too far in the direction that you want to go, does it defeat the purpose?
Well, like I say, I didn't know where I was going, so it didn't matter. What mattered what mattered is whether the person was good and interesting,
right,
or not good and not interesting. That's what mattered.
Right. Can you tell a story about one of your more interesting rides?
Well, I'll tell you, I was going through, I think, Minnesota or North Dakota, and I got two interesting rides. Maybe it was the same period of time, maybe it was different. One fellow was a farmer. It was a drought period, and he told me he didn't worry about whether there was a drought until the 4th of July, because it just meant that his corn would put down deeper roots till then. And at the end of the ride, he gave me an oatmeal cookie, which I was very appreciative. I remember that. And then going across, I'm pretty sure it was North Dakota then, I got a ride with another farmer. It was late in the day, not long before sunset. And he gave me a short ride. And he said, well, where are you going? And at that time I said, California. And he said, you probably won't get there tonight. I remember that. That was sweet. He was being clever without hurting people. I like cleverness that doesn't hurt people, and I don't like cleverness that hurts people.
I agree with you 100%, and there's a lot to be said for that. Favorite states, favorite areas to hitchhike through, favorite sorts of rides?
The West is absolutely glorious. The Rocky Mountain area and the Pacific Northwest and Southwest. But, of course, it's hard to sleep outside in the Rocky Mountains without dying of exposure. And when you get west of that, it turns into pretty much wall-to-wall people pretty quick. I've often thought that Los Angeles would be paradise if it just didn't have 20 million people crowded together. But it does. But it does.
Yeah. Great city, but I should say it's not for everybody, but it's where everybody lives. It's a
good place to live if you've got $10 million or more.
Yes. That's true.
Otherwise, you're in trouble.
I wanted to talk about just kind of the mechanics of hitchhiking, and hitchhiking is one of those things where I do recommend that people try and live vicariously through others, like yourself. But what sort of strategies do you recommend for people who are trying to get out there and hitchhike? And you've said in your book, early morning drivers are the most likely to stop and the most likely to be going far. Positioning, off ramp, on ramp.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Well, in most places, it's technically illegal to hitchhike.
Right.
But in most places it's not enforced. But when I hitchhiked, which was long ago now, half the people, it seems, who picked me up said, "Oh, people used to hitchhike, but they don't hitchhike anymore." And I was hitchhiking. And that
Right.
was 35, 40 years ago. I would recommend that nobody hitchhike unless they can't find something better to do with themselves. If you've run out of options, hitchhike, fine, but it could be fatal. And
Right.
As for where to do it, well, there are always signs that say no pedestrians beyond this point. And if you go beyond that point, a policeman's likely to force you to stop and maybe check on you to make sure you can't hitchhike at all in that area. So you probably don't want to go past that place. You want to be where it's possible for a car to stop for you without causing an accident. And that's pretty tricky on the interstate highways. And you don't get very far if you don't go on the interstate highway. So you have to you have to think for the driver. And then I always tried to make eye contact with the drivers. That's very difficult. If 1,000 drivers go past you and they don't stop, after a while you don't want to make eye contact. But I always thought that if I were a driver, I wouldn't pick up anyone who wouldn't make eye contact with me because I'd fear him.
Right. And have signs have always worked for me. Did you ever use a sign, saying, I don't know, going to Topeka or, Dodge City or any sort of directional signs?
I've seen that, but I always thought that I was the best sign. Just myself with a thumb up and my eyes meeting his eyes or her eyes.
Yep.
I always thought that was the best sign. And I wasn't going any particular place, so there was no point.
Right, that's true. That's true.
I wasn't going to Topeka.
It must be so freeing to not have a destination. To say if the person's going, in a different state than you had intended to go in that way. And was that a time in your life where was that sense of personal utopia, even though you were living on pennies?
I didn't have a tent. I had a backpack with a sleeping bag in it, but it was the most free time for me, sure. But what I discovered, I knew it already, but what became clearer and clearer to me was that freedom is half the thing. You have to get free in order to do something other than you've been programmed to do, which is killing you. But then you've got to do something then besides be free.
Right.
And that's not free. That's hard. That's a regimen. That's a discipline. But you're free to create that discipline and that regimen. But however free you were, once you create the regimen and the discipline, you're no longer as free as you were by any means. You're your own boss, and you're the hardest boss you'll ever get. And everybody in the world is your customer. And as anyone in business will tell you, the customer's the boss. So you've given up being an employee of this or that enterprise, and you've become the employee of the greatest enterprise in the world ever. And it's very demanding and grueling, but you can quit. Anytime you want, you're free to quit. And so if you don't quit, it's your free choice. But it is a choice, and then you limit your freedom very radically.
Right. I've heard it said that discipline equals freedom.
Well, it depends on who's disciplined. Whether if Putin's the one disciplining you, that's not freedom.
Sure. I think self-discipline. Right.
Well, yeah, but what you're saying about hitchhiking without self-discipline, that's freer than self-discipline, but it has no results in the long run. You're just free for a while, and then you'll die. Well, that's better than nothing.
Right.
It's better than what you were raised to do, likely, but it's short term.
Right. Right. It is short term. But what advice would you give to young people who, were of the age now that you were when you had set out on the road? How can a young person do that today? And, again, neither you or I recommend hitchhiking, and hitchhike at your own risk if you do it. But what do you recommend? How can folks find themselves and find that sense of personal freedom and find their way in the world and find a way to make the world a better place?
Oh boy. Everybody starts from a different place. So there's no single bit of advice that applies to everybody equally or maybe at all. But it seems to me that it's necessary to free yourself as much as you can from what you have been programmed, I call it, to do by your parents and your siblings and your neighbors and your school teachers and your school buddies and your early employers. If you're not satisfied, if you're satisfied, well, go ahead. But if you're not satisfied, the first thing you got to do is get freer. You have to free your mind. Your mind has to understand where your situation. That means usually facing up to how unhappy you are and how incapable you are and how neurotic you are. You can't get free and believe that you're a wonderful, successful person. If you believe you're a wonderful, successful person, you won't free yourself from who you are and what your situation is. You'll revel in it. Okay.
Right.
So if you're dissatisfied enough and you manage to get yourself free, then you have to have the kind of conversation you and I are having right now with yourself and figure out, what do you want to do beyond just be as free as you've managed to get? And then there's all kinds of glorious advice in books, in works of art, in mathematics, in science. So there's all kinds of studying you can do, and you can develop yourself physically. You can develop the skills around yourself that keep you dependent on others. You can wash the dishes instead of counting on someone else to wash the dishes. You can figure out the plumbing. You can figure out the electricity. I'm going to have to figure out the internet a lot better than I've done so far, and the devices and the programs and the applications. Not because I like it, but because if I don't figure it out and learn to navigate it better, I will be destroyed by my inability to use it.
Right.
In competition with everybody else who's trying to get attention, because I'm trying to get attention.
Sure.
So,
right.
So you have to get free, and you have to be really honest with yourself, and then you have to develop yourself. When I write about my local community, the local governments are always trying to develop the community, by which they mean more infrastructure and more tax revenue from more commerce. And when I read about the school system, they're trying to develop people to successfully compete for the best positions in the world the way it is now. But what I'm talking about is developing yourself to create the world we've been talking about that doesn't exist yet. And that means making yourself more capable of doing what needs to be done than anybody around you imagines you can or demand of themselves or supports you. You have to climb a bigger mountain than the people around you, some of whom are on the tops of little mountains and crowing like roosters. You have to keep climbing a bigger mountain, and you have to find some way to make it pleasant enough for you, which will be really rough, so that you don't get exhausted and give up and die. I often use the idea of Valley Forge, Washington and the Continental Army at Valley Forge. They were fighting what was then the greatest empire on earth, and they were bleeding and they were shoeless and they had no funds, and they were trying to hide from the British, and they found this place which was not terribly wonderful, but the British didn't know about it or didn't bother with them. And so for 2 or 3 years, they retooled themselves, they re-engineered themselves, to become
Okay.
capable of overcoming the obstacle they were overcoming. And who knew it could happen? They defeated the British Army, and they became what they were trying to become. Now, they were violent, and what they became the United States of America, which is in some ways absolutely wonderful, and in some ways absolutely terrible. So the job's not done. But but I use the idea of Valley Forge to say you use your freedom to develop yourself to do what's never been done before.
Right. Is there a sense of, maybe that striving to do better for yourself and for the world, it's always a moving goalpost, and part of the what motivates people is you may never personally get there or get there as a world, but collectively people are trying to make themselves better and make the world a better place. But the goalpost is always moving, and is that part of it? In that it's somewhat unattainable,
true.
or yeah.
Well, I hope it's not unattainable, but it's very frustrating that it is so hard to attain. And so far in history, which is only 6,000 years out of 1 million years of humanity, but so far in history, it's never been attained. And when it seemed to be attained, it was only briefly, and then it was defeated or collapsed. But let's say you lead a more normal life, you have to take pleasure in the bits of progress you're able to make. And the life I'm talking about, almost no one will tell you you've made any progress, and you almost never will. But when you do, it is, you know it. You've done something that can't be taken back that makes things better. Now, it may never be that sort of thing will prevail on Earth, or it may be, because in the long run, history is unsatisfying for almost everybody. If you think about it, your natural allies in what I'm talking about are approximately 7.5 billion people who aren't satisfied at all. It's only 10 million people or so who seem to be doing really well. And that may be an illusion. I don't know. So it's a hard road, dead or alive, like Woody Guthrie used to say.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very true. It's very true. And you mentioned Woody Guthrie in your book, did you not?
I don't know, but I mentioned him a lot. I love the guy.
And tell me more.
Well, he's one of my heroes. My heroes have not succeeded at doing what I'm trying to do, or what they were trying to do, but not only did they make some progress, some little bits of progress that was irrevocable and which serves me, but they are there. They're the infrastructure. Although they're dead, they're doing now what I'm trying to do. You got Jesus of Nazareth, you got Socrates, you got Woody Guthrie, you got Mahatma Gandhi, you've got Tom Paine, you've got a few others. And they suffered, most of them. Van Gogh. They suffered, most of them. But who doesn't suffer? But beyond suffering, they created an infrastructure that you can use climbing that bigger mountain. And that no matter how many people are unaware they existed or twist what they existed, if you've got a decent heart and you hear about them and you hear what they said or probably said, it strengthens you. It's as important, at least, as that the groceries be in the grocery store if you're trying to climb that larger mountain. And I love them for it.
And you had talked about some books and some work of art earlier on, and you had mentioned, I presume one of the works of art that you would point to would be Van Gogh, and you had mentioned just now Gandhi and Jesus and Tom Paine. What books, what literature do you recommend that folks read? What has meant a lot to you in giving you direction?
Well, again, that matters with where you start. For some people, mathematics and the sciences is the way to go. There's lots of progress to be made there. I was raised to think that art was very important, and I discovered that I thought most pictures were. I say it this way: a wonderful conversation is very valuable, but I avoid most conversation because I think it's silly, and it's usually sometimes cruel, and it's imitation of imitation of imitation of imitation,
right.
and it wastes my time. Well, I think that's the same thing about most art, most music, most songs, most poetry, most novels, most journalism, most everything that's being written. I don't want to read it. I want to keep free of it. But the stuff that's right, that is the most valuable stuff in the world. I love Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, even though 3/4 of it should have been edited away, but that other quarter is just fantastic. And I like Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching, even though he would never agree with me about struggling to make the world better. He would say that's nonsense, you can't do it. But there's so much wisdom there. And the I Ching, the Book of Changes, it's about how a person can do the kind of thing I'm talking about. It's a book of cunning for good people. And I think good people have to be at least as cunning as bad people, or we're doomed. And and I think Van Gogh's the greatest of all painters. But I think that's not a very high bar to reach, because I think most painters were just painting in the style of the time that would sell, or make the other artists think they were wonderful. And the same thing goes for singers and songwriters. I think a lot of Bob Dylan is as good as anything that's ever been done. And a lot of it is just the poor guy was just having a bad day. Well, he's got a right. And I like Joni Mitchell the same way. I think her first album was absolutely the most glorious thing that ever hit the face of the earth. But I don't care about much of the rest of it. And almost all the other, and I call the guys in Nashville. I'm sure there are guys in Nashville and women in Nashville producing good songs, but most of them, it seems to me, are songs of infatuation and falling out of infatuation, sung by people wearing cowboy hats. Well, that doesn't mean I don't think there's great stuff coming out of there, but I don't know of it. Woody Guthrie was country music, and I think he was absolutely glorious. But he was singing about struggling with the world the way it is now and how unsatisfactory it was, and he came to a bad end. He got exhausted and sick and came to a bad end, and I'm sorry for it. And one of the parts of my discipline has been don't die younger than you need to. Don't let yourself be martyred. Don't let yourself be ground down to dust. Don't let yourself be executed. But what I've discovered from that is the result is you live a very long time, and the frustrations that you undergo happen again and again and again and again. And you wonder, well, maybe I should have just gone ahead and let myself be martyred, but at least I'd be famous and people would get me. I don't know. I don't know the best way, but I wish to preserve my life, and I wish to keep using it.
That's great. And you mentioned Joni Mitchell.
I like Beethoven.
Beethoven.
I like him. Yeah, I don't care much for classical music, but I love Beethoven.
And I'm a big Joni Mitchell fan, and you had mentioned her first album, Song to a Seagull. Tell me about that.
Well, the ones I remember are Both Sides Now and Circle Game. And besides the fact that it's as wise as anything can be, she had a glorious voice, and she played the guitar gloriously, and so her presentation was a joy. Now, in art, mostly the people who get ahead are the people who are good at presenting to the public and also presenting to the people who pull the strings behind the scenes.
The tastemakers.
Okay. Anyway, the fact that her presentation is glorious is a joyful thing. But I wouldn't care, except that what she's presenting so gloriously is so wise. And to me, wisdom, again, this is infrastructure. Wisdom is infrastructure. If you're going to do what's never been done before, You have to be wise, although people laugh at the word wisdom. You have to be wise. You have to be virtuous. You have to be good. All those things.
Yeah.
And if on top of that you can present it in such a way that that the listener or the reader or whatever, it tingles all over with joy, well, that's great. I like Dostoevsky and Tolstoy a lot too.
Okay.
And the King James Version of the Bible, especially the Sermon on the Mount and Jesus' parables.
Okay. Can you talk more about that?
I'm Jewish. My father was not someone who paid much attention to it, except that he dragged me to the high holidays once a year, and I had to wear a woolen suit. Thank you very little. My mother was an agnostic and really a fierce atheist. So I didn't really pay much attention to Jesus, who I just thought was, that's part of the Catholics and the Protestants around me who are making things rough on me. Till I got to the University of Missouri, which is in the Bible Belt, and I met some people who, I met especially a fierce atheist who knew all about the Bible. And I met a minister who gave me a copy of the Old Testament. Well, I guess I bought it. I bought an old Bible for $1. It was leather bound, and all the words of Jesus were in red. And so I read all the words of Jesus in red, and I thought, that's what I think.
Wow.
That's what I think. He's the only person I ever read who thinks like I do. And so
wow.
Then I read the whole thing. I read the entire King James Version of the Bible later on when I had nothing better to do, once when I was teaching in Kansas. And a lot of it is interesting history, and a lot of it is junk, and some of it's inspiring, and more of it is junk. But out of the, I don't know, must be 2,000 pages, probably 200 or 300 pages are glorious, but the most glorious of all are the Sermon on the Mount and the parables of Jesus. And I like it. I like those even better than I like Woody Guthrie, but I put them in the same kind of category. They're about how to be good in a bad world.
I'm just writing this down, because I've heard of the Sermon on the Mount. I'm not as familiar with the parables of Jesus, but it's certainly something I'd like to check out.
You'll enjoy them if you get a chance, and they'll do you good.
Yeah. And
I also like Idries Shah, the Sufi tales of Idries Shah. They're kind of like the parables of Jesus.
Okay. Can you tell more about that?
I think Idries Shah was kind of a con man who lived in Britain. And he used his name, which sounds so exotic, to get money from rich people who thought that Sufism was a cool thing. So he kind of like cornered the money in cool Sufi stuff in the period until about 20 years ago, I guess, for about 30 years. And he got his own publishing company, and he published one book after another of Sufi tales. The Sufis are dissident Muslims, which usually get you killed in the Muslim world. So they taught by parables, which are stories that you don't understand unless you are somebody who's striving to change the world for the better forever. Otherwise, you just can't make head or tail of them. But if you are striving to change the world for better forever, they're very clear. The best one is his first one, Tales of the Dervishes. It's fantastic. I highly recommend it.
Tales of the Dervishes. Well, Eric, you've given us a lot to think about, a lot to read, a lot to follow up on. Anything that you want to leave us with today?
Yeah, help. Thank you, Mark.
Well, thank you. And how can people find out more about you? You've got your book, the so-called poems. So when will that be released?
Probably the very end of March or early in April. And they can find out about it from Westphalia Publishing at gmail.com.
Okay, and you have a website as well where your poems are published.
Yeah, and there's a way to contact me there. The website is ericchaet.wordpress.com.
All right, so ericchaet.wordpress.com.
And if anyone wants to write me a letter like you did, thank you very much. My address is
of course
1803 County Road, ZZ, like in zebras, Pierre,
okay.
Wisconsin, 54115. I need people who are capable of doing things that I'm not capable of doing. We'll make a team of it.
Right. All right. Well, you heard it here, and Eric, thank you very much for joining us today, and look forward to the book being released.